elephants are supposed to be afraid of mice. So that was one addition they did. They brought in immediately in their writing the pink elephants on parade sequence and the stork sequence. Those were two that they figured out right away.
When they were working on the story, Joe Grant and Dick Hummel would not give a completed treatment to Walt. What they would do is give him one chapter at a time to tease him.
I don't think any other movie was pitched to Walt in quite the same way, and they wrote it sort of with a hint of cliffhanger very often.
So they would put little drawings in the side of the pages. There was one that had a big teardrop on it, said, "Don't read any further, dear reader, if you are fearful that this is going to upset you, because I can tell you things are going to get a lot worse from here on." So they intrigued Walt Disney. He'd come in and he'd say, "Gee, this is great stuff. We got to, what happens next?"
Within a month, Walt looked at what they had done and knew that this was a film he wanted to take.
So within about 6 months after that, it was in storyboard stage. Then it went into animation, I think, in the fall of 1940. And it was completed pretty much before the Disney strike, which was in May of 1941.
Yeah, the strike was really brewing during the latter production of Dumbo, especially animation. And those were the guys that were really arguing on going out on strike and whether the union was a company union and whatnot. Bill Typa was key on Dumbo. Fortunately, he finished his sequences a week or so before the strike went out.
And also, at the time that Dumbo was made, the United States was contemplating going to war. The war had been raging in Europe since 1939 and had cut off about 3/4 of their overseas income. In those days, there was no Disneyland. There wasn't a lot of ancillary merchandise that they could exploit. And so they lived and died, as it were, by their films. They had to succeed. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a Disney studio.
By Pinocchio, there was very little foreign revenues. In fact, it was only dubbed into 2 languages, Spanish and Portuguese. After Snow White, which made an enormous amount of money, everything started to lose money. Fantasia lost money.
The studio was facing some really hard financial times, and they really had to try and reduce budgets without impacting the quality of the movie.
For Snow White, they developed scenes and sequences for the dwarf characters, such as a sequence where they built a bed for Snow White, or a sequence where they came down to eat the soup that she had made, and Walt pulled those sequences out. There was a lot of time and expense made in creating those sequences. On Dumbo, the story was so solid, they knew exactly how they were going to tell the story. They didn't spend their time developing sequences that would end up being thrown out.
They also had to find some new technical tricks to save money. For example, some of the backgrounds that you find in the story sketches, photostats of those were used as backgrounds. And that really had never been done before.
The backgrounds were done in very beautiful but simple watercolors. Watercolor is an interesting medium because once you lay down the color on your paper, you can't really go back and tweak it and paint over it the way that you could with oils or other medium.
On the screen, the quality was still the same. It was still the Disney quality of animation and of backgrounds and so on.
Another way that they were able to save money was by using less elaborate special effects. The effects didn't play a role in the film the way that they did in Pinocchio and Bambi.
Bambi took 9 years to make. Very cumbersome production, very work-intensive. The animal anatomy, the production value was a whole other ballgame. Whereas Dumbo was a much simpler story, and the animation is brilliant, but it's a different type, a type that's more caricature than reality-based.
Dumbo, in a sense, was much more like the silly symphonies and the short cartoons. It was kind of a long, silly symphony. And so many of the artists working on Dumbo were really the artists that grew out of those short cartoons.
I asked Joe Grant one time, what is it that makes Dumbo great? And his answer was, well, we had all the top guys. So anybody who knows the 9 Old Men is thinking, oh, well, gee, but all of them were over there working on Bambi. And yet, on Dumbo, you had all these great people who taught that lot that was making Bambi.
In a way, Dumbo is kind of a changeover. The old guard, Art Babbitt, Vladimir Teitla, some of the others who were involved with the strike left the studio after that. So a certain kind of animator left, and then people who became what were known as the 9 Old Men really took over after that.
So on Dumbo, it was really the original old guard, the guys who established the Disney style, who were really showing what they had. And they were such great pros at it, and they had so much fun on it. You also had Ward Kimball, who kind of straddled both, but he would have been a bad fit on Bambi, given that his proclivity was for cartoony things. So when Joe says, we had the top guys, I believe him.
Yeah, there's a certain vitality and spirit to the animation, I think. It's interesting that so many of the top animators on Dumbo, many of them were from New York.
There's a sort of New York sensibility in a way to the storytelling and the visualization of Dumbo. You think about a lot of those children's books that came out of New York publishing, and a lot of these animators that worked on Dumbo came out of New York animation.
Vladimir Teitler started in New York. Art Babbitt started in New York. Hicks Loki was in New York. They all kind of worked in a studio atmosphere where you tried things, you know, and if it didn't work, you tried it over again. I think they all have this kind of energy to the animation that to some of the animators who later trained at Disney had more refinement. Their stuff was still great as well, but it's a different kind of animation.
From the old guard, Bill Teitler is definitely my favorite. When you look at what he had done in the past, he did Chernabog in Fantasia. He did Stromboli in Pinocchio.
Quiet before I knock you silly.
So very powerful characters, very strong characters. And then in Dumbo, he does that small, cute, wonderful elephant that's so sweet and then completely believable and as emotional as the characters he had done in the past. And he says that he was inspired for Dumbo by his son Peter, who was 2 years old at the time.
Art Babbitt was Bill Teitler's best friend, and Babbitt was a fine, superb animator himself, very analytical. He was one of the first to take home movies of real people so that he could study it on his own. He did the stork in Dumbo. It's a wonderful, amusing caricature of the actor who did the voice, Sterling Holloway.
Which one of you ladies is expecting? I'll watch it.
Babbitt was terrific in terms of timing. One of his great pieces of animation is only a minute long, but it's the dancing mushrooms in Fantasia.
Here, take a trunk full.
Freddie Moore, who's one of my favorite animators of all time, did most of Timothy Mouse. And so he's done, Timothy wobbling and losing his balance and going, "Hiya, George," and all that stuff. He knows whereof he speaks. And it's marvelous, beautiful animation. It's also very sympathetic animation.
You ought to be ashamed of yourselves. Picking on a poor little orphan like him.
When he's admonishing the crows for making fun of Dumbo, he's doing all that stuff where Timothy is saying, go on, laugh at him.
Kick him now that he's down. Go on.
And that's very emotional stuff, too.
We don't care. Come on, Dumbo.